this Friday when we saw the latest installment of Donald Trump's favorite rhetorical trope when attempting to defend someone who is basically indefensible. I hardly know the guy. In this case, the guy is the newly appointed acting Attorney General Matthew Whitaker, from whom Trump already seems to be distancing himself.
Well, Matt Whitaker, I don't know Matt Whitaker. Matt Whitaker worked for Jeff Sessions, and he was always extremely highly thought of, and he still is. But I didn't know Matt Whitaker. He worked for Attorney General Sessions. He was very, very highly thought of. Now, in all fairness to Matt Whitaker, who, again, I didn't know, okay? Other than through reputation, Matt Whitaker is a highly respected man, but I didn't know Matt Whitaker. But he's a highly respected man.
He's the greatest guy, the most wonderful guy, the most perfect guy. He's an amazing guy. I barely know the guy. Never met the guy. I've never heard of him. All right. So that sudden Trumpian skittishness over his replacement for Jeff Sessions comes amid an outcry from Trump's critics over Whitaker's past comments on the Mueller probe, including a cascade of newly surfaced audio that vividly demonstrates Whitaker's vehement opposition to that probe, suggesting Whitaker long ago decided, echoing Trump himself, that there was no collusion, no obstruction, and that Whitaker is resolved to limit the investigation.
There is no case for obstruction of justice because the president had all of the power of the executive and delegates that to people like the FBI director and the attorney general. This hyperventilation of, what we see here is I don't think sustainable, based on these facts.
The truth is there was no collusion with the Russians in the Trump campaign. There was interference by the Russians into the election, but that is not the collusion with the campaign. And that's where the left seems to be just combining those two issues.
An effort by Jim Comey to get this, put in place and have somebody that he's very familiar with and Bob Mueller conduct the investigation. So I think it smells a little fishy, but I just hope it doesn't turn into a fishing expedition because I will be one of the ones jumping up and down.
Good for you, yeah.
Making sure that the limitations on this investigation continue because that's the way it's supposed to be.
Those sound bites and several just like them have come to light in the last 24 hours, raising pointed questions about whether Whitaker's antagonism toward the Mueller probe was for Donald Trump a feature and not a bug, and maybe, in fact, a prerequisite for Whitaker's appointment, which under normal circumstances would have gone to Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein. The other question, whether Whitaker may, in fact, have even promised Trump some action against the Mueller probe in exchange for being elevated. Trump responded to those questions this morning with another of his favorite tactics, an ad hominem attack on a reporter.
You want him to rein in Robert Mueller?
What a stupid question that is. What a stupid question. But I watch you a lot. You ask a lot of stupid questions.
Man. All right. Joining us now, former U.S. Attorney Joyce Vance, Jeremy Bash, the former chief of staff at the CIA and the Pentagon. Here on set with me, we have Jennifer Rubin, Washington Post opinion writer, and the great Maya Wiley, senior vice president for social justice at the New School. All of them, every one of them, thank God, are MSNBC analysts. I want to start with Joyce, my friend, Alabamian. You look at the things that this man, Mr. Whitaker, has said before taking this job, mostly on CNN. How problematic are those things in a normal universe, and maybe even in the universe we live in, for this appointment?
It's a conflict of interest, and he should be required to recuse from overseeing the Russia investigation. In fact, I suspect that the ethics professionals at PREO, the DOJ office that attorneys in the Justice Department go to for advice on ethical matters, will advise him that he must recuse. He has, if not an actual conflict, certainly the appearance of a conflict, which is the standard that people in DOJ use. And, John, it's really important to note that the DOJ conflict standards require lawyers to recuse if they have a personal or a political relationship with someone who's interested in the outcome of a case or someone who's involved in a case. And Whitaker's got both. He has a personal relationship, a political relationship with Sam Clovis, whose campaign he ran. Certainly he appears to have a political relationship with the president, who has an interest in the outcome of this investigation. So in no way, shape, or form should he remain in the case but it's clear he's going to.
Right.
In fact, it's increasingly clear that that's why he was brought on board.
Yeah, so Jeremy, I want to ask you, the way in which or the recusal thing works, the DOJ, there's no law or even a regulation that compels you to go to the ethics folks at Justice and say, what should I do here? But both legal ethics and political probity normally means that if you think you might have a conflict, you go and say, ask for a recommendation. It appears that Whitaker's not going to do that. In fact, as Joyce just said, that the reason he was chosen is precisely because he has these conflicts. How does that recusal question play out as a matter, just practically speaking, over the days ahead?
Well, I think you're right. I think the proper thing would be, as the chief legal officer of the United States of America, for him to ask the professional ethics attorneys within the Department of Justice for an opinion. And if they were to come back with an opinion, I think that the substance of the opinion would be exactly what Joyce just referenced. But I think there's no way in heck that he's going to do that, because the terms of his employment with Donald Trump was that he would not recuse himself, because, of course, that was the origin of Trump's concern about Jeff Sessions. And so the proper thing here, John, would be for Rod Rosenstein to retain authority over the Bob Mueller probe, for there to be no interference in the Bob Mueller probe. And I think where this may be heading is that the Democrats take control of any of the committees in Congress come January. They'll put Mark Whitaker under oath. He may try to assert presidential privilege or executive privilege, but the president has to assert that. And so we're heading for some legal sparky times here.
All right, I want to play another piece of sound here before I come to the table, where we get to hear Whitaker talking about a subject that obviously has been really important over the course of the investigation into Trump, which is the question of his finances, his business, his family, where the red lines supposedly exist. Let's listen to what Whitaker had to say about that previously.
If they are looking at unrelated to the 2016 election Trump finances, that they have crossed the red line and they are outside of the scope of their investigation, and essentially they are on a fishing expedition, which is very dangerous to the republic.
Jeremy, I want to ask you, just come back to you for this. That is basically like it's not Trump friendly. It doesn't echo Trump. It's almost as if scripted by Trump. It's just talking points, things that Trump has in fact himself said to the New York Times and others. Does that not make it feel very much like those comments were an audition for this job?
Yeah, they were the job qualifications. Exactly right, John. And of course, the reason why they're concerned about it is because those finances could show Russian leverage over the Trump organization and Trump himself, which of course is at the heart of the national security investigation that Bob Mueller is undertaking.
Jennifer, let me ask you, you come to you listen, you see the way this is all unfolded. At this moment, we don't know what precise conversations took place before Whitaker got this job, but the prima facie case, as Jeremy suggests, is pretty strong. What do you think, if you look at everything he said as a CNN correspondent and you look at his positions and how much they echo Trump, as I said a second ago, what conclusions do you draw?
Well, first of all, I start with the Constitution, which says he shouldn't be there to begin with. Right. And there's a fundamental issue that goes beyond the Russia probe to simply his appointment. We have a Constitution that provides for advice and consent by the Senate. He picked a guy out, in essence saying, you in the blue shirt, come on, be my attorney general. You're not allowed to do that. When you remove someone, you can have someone in an acting position who's in the line of succession. That would be Mr. Rosenstein. But he doesn't have the right, without Senate approval, to stick his crony in there. And if he does, virtually everything he would do is a legal nullity. He would be suspect. So people who are being prosecuted, any documents he's signing, any appointments he makes, all of that is invalid in essence. So I think you have to start there. And what's interesting now is you've seen Republican conservative lawyers, including George Conway, Kellyanne's husband, come forward to make this case. It's a pretty good case. And frankly, there are a lot of people who could litigate this. Anyone who's being prosecuted by the Justice Department, anyone who's getting a subpoena from the Justice Department, lots of people can litigate this. As far as the Russia probe goes, it's another of the outrageous steps, and you're now hearing rumbling from the Justice Department itself. You're beginning to hear leaks. You're beginning to hear criticism from the building. And that will build if he is allowed to stay.
So, Maya, I want to ask you this. So we saw yesterday this op-ed piece in the New York Times. Neil Katyal, former Solicitor General, and George Conway, who Jennifer just referenced to, is, of course, Kellyanne's husband, but is a forceful Trump critic, making the case this is an unconstitutional appointment because you got to be Senate confirmed, not necessarily for this job, but for some job you have to have been Senate confirmed in order to be in this job. What's been interesting to me me about that is not just the George Conway, but you hear people like Eric Erickson. You see, even on Fox News, you see some of the legal analysts coming out and saying, yeah, this is pretty open and shut, and how could they have missed this?
Well, I think what's open and shut is that there's no question that Matt Whitaker must be recused from the investigation, from overseeing the Bob Mueller's investigation. Actually, lawyers, and Steve Vladeck has a very good opinion editorial piece about this question. I actually disagree with the analysis that suggests it's unconstitutional. Okay. And the reason for that is first of all, there's an 1898 Supreme Court opinion directly on point that says actually the president can appoint someone in an interim capacity. And secondly, government actually needs it to be able to function in the event that there is the need for continuity. Right. So there are three very strong categories of reasons why Matt Whitaker should not be in this position that go to qualification, that go to the fact that this is a incredibly important position as being the chief law enforcement officer for the nation, not for the president, that he should recuse himself at a minimum from this investigation. And I think their argument goes more directly to the fact that he should not be confirmed if he does come. But I actually think it's important to pay attention to the legal arguments that say that it is actually constitutional.
It's interesting that Justice Thomas, of all people, has taken the contrary view. And since he's the favorite justice of the President of the United States, perhaps she should listen to him. It's not come up in exactly this context, but it has come up in a context involving the National Labor Relations Board. The difference being, if someone is a senior official, reports directly to the president, you do need confirmation by the Senate.
I want to play another piece of sound just because it goes back to the very beginning when we were talking about the notion that, I hardly knew the guy. It turns out that although Trump now says I hardly know the guy, not that long ago, he had a slightly different perspective on his relationship with Mr. Whitaker. Let's play that.
I never talk about that, but I can tell you Matt Whitaker is a great guy. I mean, I know Matt Whitaker, but I never talk about conversations that I had. But, the Washington Post gets it wrong a lot. That's the only thing.
Yeah, but the conversation is that you are in active talks to replace the Attorney General of the United States.
I'm not doing anything. I want to get the elections over with. We'll see what happens.
So, Joyce, amazing breaking news. Donald Trump contradicts himself and has been caught in yet another lie. It does seem relevant to me, though, to ask the question, is the fact that Trump is backpedaling and distancing himself in this way, which we've seen him do on countless occasions in the past, does it suggest to you that he is attuned, perhaps, to this, maybe not unanimous, but this bipartisan sense of concern, at a minimum, in some cases outrage, over the fact that this guy who does not really seem qualified for the job has been put in this important a job?
I'm not sure that he's concerned. I think he just wants to get away with it. He's been very facile on a number of occasions with people being close to him suddenly becoming people that he's never known before. He's gotten away with it, so maybe he thinks he can get away with it again here. But what's very clear is that whether it was an explicit agreement or whether Whitaker was just sort of winking at Trump in these television appearances, and Trump plucked him out of the wilds of Iowa to come be the chief of staff for the Attorney General, which made him eligible for this interim appointment, that there's been a meeting of the minds about why he's here, and Trump wants him there. Right.
Jeremy, I want to ask you, you're in addition to being a person of great substance, you also have good political antenna. Do you think that Donald Trump is, at least, at a very minimum, hedging his bets here so that he can go scurrying away from Matt Whitaker if it turns out that his position or his appointment here turns out to be politically untenable?
Yeah, I think he is very thin-skinned. He senses the criticism. He thought he could sneak this one by in the day after the election. He's not able to do that. And so I think he's reacting to the fact that Matt Whitaker is not long for this world in terms of this job, and Donald Trump has to go to Plan B.
So the other thing that I want to raise before we have to end this block is the thing that, in some ways, because I'm a dork, has upset me the most about this entire thing is this Q&A that Whitaker did when he was running for public office back in Iowa, when he was trying to win the Iowa Senate seat that ultimately went to Joni Ernst. He was filling out one of these questionnaires the candidates do fill out, and he said the following things about the role of the courts and about one particular decision. I'm going to read this here. The courts are supposed to be the the inferior branch of our three branches of government. We have unfortunately offloaded many of our tough public policy issues onto the court, and they've decided them. Unelected judges are deciding many of the issues of the day. There are so many bad rulings. I would start with the idea of Marbury versus Madison. Maya, for those who are unfamiliar with Marbury versus Madison, I'd like you to just give a brief explanation of why it is the central, fundamental, seminal decision in the whole history of American jurisprudence as relates to the Supreme Court of the United States.
Supreme Court is exactly a check and balance on the executive branch, violating the U.S. Constitution. If you essentially take away that power and say that the courts do not have an independent role, subject them to elections, by the way, and we have states that actually have elected judges, where we politicize the interpretation of the law rather than keep it neutral and focused on the structure of our government, of our democracy, we essentially erode having a functional democracy that is not subject to authoritarianism.
Right. Joyce Vance, I just want to ask you, Marbury versus Madison, the thing that created judicial review, is it not the case that if a person who's the acting Attorney General of the United States says that Marbury versus Madison is wrongly decided, that you can only come up with two possible options for what that means? Either he is a clown or a stooge.
I'll just say that Whitaker is clearly outside the mainstream of American jurisprudence. I could not agree with Maya more. This is the man who's now overseeing all of the criminal and civil litigation and the appellate litigation, including in front of the Supreme Court, on behalf of the United States. He's said that he believes judges need to be good Christians, that they shouldn't be outside of that mainstream. He's indicated that he's not a proponent of judicial review of the law. We are in treacherous waters.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.